Hi guys, good evening. Welcome to this revision session for elements of costing. Some of you may have been in the session last week. Those others of you might be just joining this evening. Today we're going to be looking through task 2. Task 2 from your exam. We've just got a few examples, 3 examples of something that you may get in task 2. So we'll work through them together and hopefully make the task not seem so bad. Not quite so straightforward as task 1, I wouldn't say, but as with all this stuff, guys, it's just a matter of practice. The more times you can practice these tasks, you know, you're not going to have a surprise when it gets to the exam. So practice makes perfect. So let's have a look through. Okay. Task 2, we won't go through too much of this page, but it just tells us here 10 marks, so about 9 minutes to complete it. Oops. It is important, guys, I said it last week, but to keep an eye on your timings. You might have some calculations to do in task 2, looking at the high-low method of splitting fixed and variable costs. So we'll see that in a minute. But what you don't want to be doing is getting too bogged down and spending half an hour on task 2, which will then, you know, have a knock-on effect to the rest of the exam. So obviously don't worry about, you know, to the second, but you want to be keeping an eye on your time as best. I just let someone else into the waiting room. Okay, guys, so the majority of this task is to do with, as it says, their cost behaviour. So is a cost fixed? Is it variable or is it semi-variable? And we talked about this a bit last week, didn't we? A fixed cost doesn't change in relation to how many units we're producing. So if I pay rent on a factory, that rent does not change in relation to how many units of my product I'm making within the factory. So jars of jam, if I make 1 jar of jam or 100 jars of jam, the rent on factory is not affected by that. So that's a fixed cost. Your variable cost will be things like materials and labour that go into the product. So the more jars of jam I make, the higher my material costs. And then a semi-variable cost has a fixed and a variable element, doesn't it, guys? So often, you know, a phone bill is a good example. You have your kind of fixed monthly rental, which will be fixed regardless of what calls and usage you have. And then on top of that, you might have a variable element for usage. And what we need to be able to do as part of this task is split those semi-variable costs down into the fixed bit and the variable bit, so that we can then apply that and say, okay, well, if I know I'm going to make 100 units, for example, what is my total cost going to be? So let's have a look. I've just got a few people tuning in live, so I kind of won't ask too many questions, guys, and sort of put you on the spot. But obviously, if you do have questions as we work through, please do let me know. Okay, so we've got 3 examples of this to go through, and the first one's quite straightforward, and then they build up and get a bit more complicated as we go through. Okay. So what it's asking us to do here, identify whether the following statements describe variable costs, fixed or semi-variable, and we have to put a tick in the right place. These all tend to be quite repetitive and quite similar. So as I say, if you've done a few of these, if you've done your practice on these, then when you get to the exam, you're not going to have any nasty surprises. Okay, so let's have a look and see what we're going to do with this one. The first example here, the total cost when 100 units is produced is £1,000, and the total cost when 200 units is produced is £2,000. We can rule out, can't we, guys, straight away fixed costs. It's not going to be a fixed cost because the total cost is changing. Yeah, it's moved, hasn't it, from 1,000 to 2,000 because the number of units has gone up. So we know that it's not going to be a fixed cost. So we can rule that one out. So what I would do next here is to look at, right, well, what is the cost per unit and see if that's staying the same or if it's changing. So I could work out my cost per unit first of all, £1,000 divided by 100 units, costing me, isn't it, guys, £10 per unit. And then do the same thing on the second example. So when you now have 200 units, the total cost is £2,000. So £2,000 divided by 200 units, it's still £10 per unit. So that is telling us, isn't it, guys, that we've got a variable cost. I'll just do you a quick summary. I'll move it down here. So I'll put that page back in a minute, but I'll email these notes out to you guys tomorrow as soon as I get a chance. So just a quick summary, if in terms of, sorry, variable cost per unit, variable cost per unit remains constant. Okay, so I'll put that back in a minute, but that's what you can see has happened up here. The cost per unit is constant, it stayed the same. Yep, it's £10 per unit regardless of how many units you're making. That's telling you that it's a variable cost. Okay? So variable cost per unit is constant or stays the same regardless of production. You won't ever see a situation where variable cost per unit changes if it's a variable cost. Variable cost in total increases as production increases. Which makes sense, doesn't it? If it costs me £1 to produce 1 jar of jam, then if I only produce 1, it's cost me £1. If I've produced 100, it's cost me £100. So if the total cost is increasing as production increases, that's suggesting it could be a variable cost. As opposed to fixed costs in total, these will be constant. In other words, stay the same regardless of production. So that's the first thing that I would do in these tasks. I mean, it depends what information they've given you, but if they have given you information about total costs, then that's the first thing I would check. If total costs are not staying the same, you can rule out fixed costs. It's not going to be a fixed cost. And lastly, fixed cost per unit. We talked about this last week for any of you who were here last week, guys. Fixed cost per unit, if you remember, this decreases as production increases. Because the point being that your total fixed cost will stay the same, but you're going to divide it by more units. Yep. So if I've got my rent on my factory of 100,000, if I'm only making 1 jar of jam, then the cost per unit is 100,000. If I make 100,000 jars of jam, then my cost per unit is only going to be £1, isn't it? So given the fact that total fixed costs are constant, the more units you produce, the cost per unit will go down. Okay. So you might just find that that helps you to answer these tasks, guys. Obviously, with a semi-variable cost, we'll see what's going to happen to that in a minute. But I'll leave it on the screen just for a moment longer in case anyone's copying it down. But these notes will get emailed out to you tomorrow anyway, so you'll have them then. I intended to turn my camera off, guys. I did this exact thing last week. I meant to turn it off when I started recording and I didn't do it. So let's just switch that off now. You don't need to see my face and whispering on at you. There we go. Okay, so let's carry on and fill the rest of this in. Okay, so the first one we said, we know it's not a fixed cost because the total costs have moved. We've now figured out that the cost per unit has stayed the same, so we know that that's a variable cost. Okay, we'll look at the next one. Now they've told us different information on the next one, haven't they? They've given us the cost per unit is £1 when 50,000 units are being produced, and £2 a unit when 25,000 units are being produced. Okay, so what we need to do here is work out, right, well, what would the total cost be? You can see that cost per unit is changing, isn't it? It's gone from £1 to £2. So we can rule out variable costs because we know, and we wrote in our summary, that variable cost per unit, will stay constant. So if the cost per unit is moving, we know that it's not going to be a variable cost. So what I would do here is work out the total cost. £1 per unit at 50,000 units. One multiplied by the other gives us £50,000 in total, doesn't it, guys? Whereas when it's at £2 per unit for 25,000 units, one multiplied by the other, total cost is still 50,000. So because my total cost is staying the same regardless of production, we know it's a fixed cost. And if we look back to the summary, we said, didn't we, here, fixed cost per unit decreases as production increases. We can see that that is what's happened, isn't it? Yeah. When I make 25,000 units, it's costing me £2 each. When production's gone up to 50,000 units, cost per unit's gone down to £1 each. And the last bit here, cost of 20,000. To be honest, they've made it quite easy for us. They've said are made up of a fixed charge and a further cost per unit. So we know that's semi-variable because what they've told us in the question is kind of the definition, isn't it, guys, of a semi-variable cost. You've got a fixed bit and a variable bit. Okay. It's not necessarily going to be that you'll have one in each box, but it's quite likely, yeah, that you'd have something, an example like this, one would be variable, one fixed, and one semi-variable. But it's not guaranteed, it's not, certain, so don't let that kind of put you off. If you think two of them might be variable, that doesn't mean it's wrong. Any questions on that part, guys? So we'll see a couple more of those, but once you've seen one, you've almost seen them all. They get quite repetitive, which is a good thing for you guys because it means you won't have any surprises when you get to your exam. Okay. And then in part B, we're going to be asked whether to classify the following costs as fixed or variable. Factory rent charge is a classic example of a fixed cost. The rent is not going to change regardless of how many units you're producing. It's not to say the rent bill can never change or can never go up or down because, certainly landlords can put the rent up, can't they? But the point of it being a fixed cost is that it doesn't vary with units of production. Any rent increases are not to do with how many units we're producing in the factory. Likewise, annual property insurance costs, that would be fixed as well, wouldn't it, guys? Because your insurance is not going to kind of increase and decrease with regards to how many units you're making. Not on an annual basis. You're going to get the bill for the year, and then that won't be affected by how many units you produce during that year. So that would be a fixed cost as well. And the materials used to produce units of output. Best example really we've got of a variable cost. That's like your ingredients for your jars of jam. We know that the more units you produce, the higher the material cost is going to be. So that will be a variable cost there. Okay. Excellent. The second example we've got of this task then, of task 2, part A looks very similar to what we just saw, and then part B is the high-low method. So you might find in your exam you could get something a bit more complicated, more along these lines to get you, tested on that high-low method. Okay, well, let's have a look first of all at part A. The cost is £5 per unit at 20,000 units and £2.50 a unit at 40,000. Having a look at what's happening to the cost per unit, we can see that it's changing, can't we? So that is immediately ruling out variable cost. Now, it's not going to be a variable cost because we know there that the cost per unit stays the same. So what I would do, as we did before, is multiply along. £5 per unit, 20,000 units, one multiplied by the other gives us a total cost of £100,000. And then do the same thing again, £2.50 a unit, 40,000 units, one multiplied by the other. Total cost is still £100,000. And we know, don't we, that if total cost remains the same, regardless of what's happening to production, then we've got a fixed cost. And it illustrates that point again, doesn't it? Because you've got £100,000 when it's spread over 20,000 units, each unit's taking £5 of that cost. Whereas when the same £100,000 gets spread over 40,000 units, the cost per unit goes down. Yeah, because you've got the same fixed cost, but more units to spread it across. The next one, let's have a look. Costs at 5,000 units are £30,000 and at 7,000 units are £32,000. You have to take care to read the question. Yeah, we've said time management is important, and it is, but you don't want to rush through and skim over the questions. You need to read them carefully, because sometimes they'll give you the cost per unit, sometimes they'll give you total costs, and it is very much going to, affect your answer. So here we've got total costs, first of all, of 30,000. And then when we get to 7,000 units, total costs has moved to 32,000. So we can rule out, can't we, guys, fixed costs? Yeah, because my total cost has changed. It hasn't remained constant. So what we need to do is work out the cost per unit. £30,000 when there's 5,000 units. So one divided by the other gives us £6 per unit. Then when we get to 7,000 units, it's now costing us £32,000. So £32,000 divided by 7,000 units. We now get a cost per unit of £4.57. So we've ruled out fixed costs because total costs have changed. We can now also rule out variable costs because the cost per unit has changed as well, hasn't it? It was £6 per unit. It's now £4.57. And we know that for it to be a variable cost, the cost per unit stays the same. We've ruled out fixed cost. We've ruled out variable costs. The fact that total cost is changing and cost per unit is changing, that is telling us we've got a semi-variable cost. Okay. So that's how we're going to know it's semi-variable, because total costs have changed and the cost per unit has changed. Last box then, the total cost when 1,000 units are produced is 1,500, and when 1,500 units are produced is 2,250. Total cost 1,500, total cost 2,250. Total cost is moved, so we are ruling out fixed cost. And the good thing is, at least once you've done that, then you've narrowed down your answer, haven't you? You know which one that you're definitely not going to tick. Okay, so again, we need to take care to read the question, see what they've given me, what information. When the units are 1,000, the cost is 1,500. So £1,500 divided by 1,000 units gives us £1.50 per unit. And then do the same again on the next situation. So £2,250 now divided by 1,500 units, we still get £1.50 per unit. So we know that as cost per unit is staying the same, as cost per unit is constant, it's a variable cost. Okay. In your exam, you'll be, kind of doing these workings yourself. The numbers that I'm writing down are just to help us see where the answers are coming from. In your exam, you would just tick in the relevant box. Okay. Any questions on that part A there, guys? The same really, wasn't it, as what we saw in the previous example, but now we've had a look and seen how that we know if we've got a semi-variable cost. Okay. Part B then is looking at the high-low method. Excuse me. This is something that you will see, several times throughout your studies if you decide to take AAT kind of further to level 3 or even level 4 and beyond. So the high-low method is something that's quite important. And once you've kind of got the hang of it, guys, then hopefully it should be quite straightforward. Okay, so what they've given us 4 different values of output, by which they mean number of units produced, and 4 different values of total cost. The first thing we do with the high-low method is choose high and low number of units. Yeah. So your step 1 is always pick high and low output, not high and low costs. It might be the case that they aren't the same. Now, in this example, they are the same, but it's high and low output. That's what you need to be choosing. So you've got high and low and their associated costs. Step 2 is then to work out variable cost per unit. And we work this out by doing change in costs divided by change in activity. or if we want to write it out a bit longer, we can kind of summarize in a table. So 5,000 units, total cost 19,000. At 8,000 units, total cost is 28,000. So we can work out the difference between the two. I'm doing one take away the other. Obviously, I've written them, you know, low above high. There's a difference between the two. So 3,000 units is the difference. And in terms of costs, the difference is 9,000. Variable cost per unit then we work out as change in costs, which was £9,000, divided by change in activity, 3,000 units, to give us £3 per unit. So we're going to need that. Once we've done that, step 3 is to work out fixed costs, and we do this using a total cost equation. Total cost equals fixed cost plus variable cost. Yeah, there's no other type of costs. You might have semi-variable, but all that means is that there's, you know, some of it is fixed and some of it is variable. So total cost equals fixed cost plus variable cost. We can rewrite this to say, well, total variable cost is the same thing as variable cost per unit times by number of units. And then what I do is I pick either high or low from the two sets of data that I've already been using and plug that into this equation. So I picked high. So I'll pick this set of data, 8,000 units, total cost £28,000. So total cost £28,000 equals fixed cost is the bit that I don't know at the moment, plus variable cost per unit I've just calculated in step 2, that's £3. And number of units, when the total cost is £28,000, the number of units is 8,000. Multiply out the brackets, £28,000 equals fixed cost plus 24,000. Take 24,000 away from both sides to get fixed costs on their own, £4,000. Okay. So we're almost there. Obviously, we haven't quite answered the question yet because the question is asking us the total cost for month 5 if output is planned to be 7,500 units. Well, the good thing is we can answer this now because we know what fixed costs are and we know what variable cost is per unit. Total cost equals fixed cost plus variable cost. Equal. Fixed cost, £4,000. We've just worked that out, haven't we? In step 3 down here. Variable cost per unit we worked out in step 2. £3 a unit. And the number of units that we are interested in now for month 5, 7,500, just as given to us in the question. Okay. So fixed cost of £4,000 plus variable cost per unit of 3 times my number of units, 7,500. We should get 26,500, and that's what we're going to put in as our answer. Okay. So, although in theory tasks 1 and tasks 2 in this exam have both got kind of 9 minutes allocated to them each, I would have thought task 2 would take you longer than task 1. So my advice would be to sort of make a note to yourself at 18 minutes in, yep, tasks 1 and 2. .18 and use that 18 minutes to do both of the tasks, because if you sort of drag the time on task 1 out to 10 minutes or 9 minutes, you might then find that you are kind of rushing a bit more in task 2. But again, practice makes perfect. The more of this high-low method you guys do, you will get super speedy at doing it. So we've got one more to go through over the page. Any questions on that part B there, guys? Okay. Over the page then, the most complicated example of a task, task 2 that we've got. So we'll go through this, fairly similar to what we've already seen. Certainly we are starting to recognise this part A. Okay, at 50,000 units, the cost is £20,000. At 80,000 units, the cost is 27,200. We're ruling out fixed costs, aren't we, guys? Because total cost has moved. I'm going to look at what is the cost per unit. £20,000 divided by 50,000 units, 0.4 or 40p per unit. £27,200 divided by 80,000 units gives us 34p per unit. So we've ruled out fixed costs because total costs are moving. We can now rule out variable costs because cost per unit has moved as well. And that's how we know that we've got a semi-variable cost. Because total costs are not constant and cost per unit is not constant either. Next example, okay, I can straight away see that my total costs are moving, so it's not going to be a fixed cost. £10,500 divided by 3,000 units gives me £3.50 per unit. Do the same on the next set of data, so 15,750 divided by 4,500 units gives us £3.50 again. So we know we've got a variable cost because total cost has moved, but cost per unit is staying constant at £3.50. So we've got a variable cost there. And on the last example, now they're not giving us total cost, but what we can see is that cost per unit was £4, then it becomes £2.50. So we can rule out variable costs because cost per unit has changed, hasn't it, guys? So because they've given us different information, now we're going to multiply along to find out what happens to total cost. 10,000 units at the cost of £4 a unit. So total cost, £40,000. And at 16,000 units, the cost is £2.50 per unit. So multiply together, total cost is still £40,000. So we've got a fixed cost there. Okay, so very repetitive in that part A there. Certainly something like that is what you'd be expecting in your exam. So once you've practiced a few of them, you get the hang of it and hopefully shouldn't be too time consuming on that. Part B, we need to figure out, we need to, tell the examiner, are these fixed or variable? Wages of factory staff paid at a piece rate. Piece rate, guys, is different from a salary, isn't it? A salary is where you get, a fixed monthly amount, for example, which is what most of us probably do. Getting paid a piece rate means you're getting paid an amount per item that you make. So maybe they're in the factory making jars of jam and they're getting paid 50p per jar, something like that. So it's going to be a variable cost, isn't it, guys? The cost of those wages will be higher the more units are produced. An advertising campaign will be a fixed cost. The cost of that will have nothing to do with how many jars of jam are getting produced within the factory, and likewise salaries of security guards, not related, is it, to volume of production, not related to how many units are produced. So that is a fixed cost there. And then part C is the high-low method again, just they've given it to us in a slightly different format. You can see what they've given you is high and low activity and their associated costs. So they've almost kind of done step one for you. Pick high and low output or high and low activity. They've done that bit for us. So we need to use the high-low method. We're going to work out variable cost per unit, just like we did before. So units compared to cost, I'm going to put high in first this time to make sure that we can see where the numbers are coming from. So 8,000 units is my highest number of units, costing £47,000. Low number of units, 2,000, costing £17,000. Difference between the two, we get a difference of 6,000 units and a difference in cost of 30,000. One divided by the other, £30,000 divided by 6,000 units gives us variable cost per unit of £5. And we then put that into our total cost equation, just like we did before. Total cost equals fixed cost plus variable cost per unit times number of units. I've picked high. It doesn't matter if you pick high or low. It's going to give you exactly the same answer. I've picked high. So total cost 47,000. Fixed cost, the bit that I don't know. Variable cost per unit, I've just worked out is £5. And number of units when cost is £47,000 was 8,000. Multiply out what's in the brackets. 47,000 equals fixed cost plus 5 times 8,000, which is 40,000. Take 40,000 away from both sides to get fixed cost on its own, £7,000. So that bit is the same as what you've already seen. That's just your high-low method. Now what you need to do is look in the table and say, okay, what are they actually asking me for? Well, I can see there's a row for fixed cost. And we know that by their very nature, fixed costs don't vary with number of units. So now I've calculated that, I can go and enter that into every box. Now, in your exam, it would be, you would see which boxes you were needing to fill in, because they would only be the ones you were allowed to type in. It's probably likely to be what's here shaded in green. But for argument's sake, let's just fill all of it in because we can. Fixed costs will not vary with production. So we can fill in £7,000 right the way across. Total variable costs, we've worked out, haven't we, £5 per unit. So then we just need to multiply by number of units under each column. So £5 a unit times by 2,000 units gives us £10,000. And you can see then, can't you, if you add down the table, it gives you 17,000. £5 a unit at 4,000 units gives us 20,000 total variable cost. £5 a unit at 6,000 units gives us 30,000 in total, and at 8,000 units, 40,000 in total. And you can see again, can't you, now on the right hand side, that those numbers do add down correctly. And then the last thing you just need to do is add up for 4,000 and 6,000 units the total cost, 27,000 and 37,000. Okay. And that is it, guys, for the session. That is it for this task. Obviously, if you've got any questions, if you're watching this live, please let me know in the chat box. Otherwise, you guys kind of can email me if anything kind of specific on this this session comes up. I will email you all the recording tomorrow, and I'll attach these notes to them as well. And then I'll attach as well a blank task 3 that you'll be going through next week with my colleague Amy, I believe. Okay. Okay, guys. Thank you very much then. See you another time.